A red-headed woman, around 30, lies face down on a table in a conference room. A male voice from a speaker asks, "Who are you?" twice before she wakes up groggily, confused. She rubs her neck in pain, and the voice apologizes for rushing, then asks her to take a survey. She is confused and asks who's speaking. When she tries to leave, she finds the door locked and begins banging on it, demanding to be let out. Exhausted, she sits on the floor and, defeated, agrees to take the survey. The voice asks 5 questions, including personal ones she can't answer, like the color of her mother's eyes. After the questions, the door unlocks and a man enters, saying, "That's a perfect score." The man, later identified as Mark, leaves his car and enters a large office building, going through security and changing his badge and clothes in a locker room. He arrives at work, where he interacts with colleagues Dylan, Irv. He is then called to his boss Miss Coble's office and is informed that Petey no longer works there. Mark is promoted to department chief and given a new task: to oversee the training of the new employee, Helly. Helly is in a room where Mark is tasked with conducting her training. Following a script, he asks her the same questions as in the earlier survey. When she tries to leave, she finds herself in a looping hallway, unable to escape. Eventually, she realizes something is terribly wrong, but Mark, now improvising, tries to calm her down. Later, Helly watches a video of her outie self, explaining that she chose to undergo a procedure called severance, which splits her work and personal life memories. Helly is horrified, realizing her work self will never leave the office. She angrily confronts Mark and the others, feeling trapped. Mark returns home, drinks, and avoids talking about his past, including the anniversary of his wife's death. His interactions with his family and friends reveal his emotional distance and how deeply he is affected by his work and the severance procedure. At home, Mark cleans a gutter, lost in thought. Later, at Pip's, a man sits across from him and tells him to hang up the phone. Mark recognizes him as the man from Devin's yard. The man introduces himself as Petey, saying he's from work and was severed, but bypassed the implant with help. Petey warns that Grainer is after him, hands Mark a red envelope, and quickly leaves. This scene describes Helly RS' early experience at Lumen Industries, focusing on her orientation and the severance procedure. Mr. Milchick guides Helly through Lumen and emphasizes its strict, cult-like devotion to founder Keir Egan. The procedure severs a person's work identity, innie, from their outside identity, outie, leaving Helly disoriented when her innie self awakens inside the building after surgery. Mark Scout, another employee, performs his routine duties, but is haunted by the recent departure of his coworker, Petey. Helly begins her training in macrodata refinement under Mark and Dylan, who explain the job's mundane tasks and bizarre incentives, like the elusive waffle party. Helly struggles to understand the disconnection between her innie and outie selves, asking questions about quitting, which are dismissed by her coworkers. Milchick leads the group in a forced bonding exercise, revealing odd details about Helly's outie, but Helly remains frustrated. She attempts to leave the building, writing a resignation note, but is caught by Lumen's code detectors. Mark intervenes to protect her, but he is sent to the break room for punishment, where he faces a robotic recitation exercise to atone for his actions. Mark also begins investigating Petey's disappearance, discovering that Petey, after reintegration, has been suffering from severe symptoms. Their interactions reveal that Lumen's severance process is much more sinister and controlling than it appears. Meanwhile, Irving, another worker, develops an interest in Bert, the head of optics and design. Their interaction suggests a budding friendship, though Lumen's strict rules continue to overshadow all personal connections. The episode ends with Helly making her first real contribution at work, refining data, but the underlying tension of their severed existence remains palpable throughout their experiences at Lumen. Mark checks on Petey outside the bathroom, asking if he's okay. Petey says he slipped and jokes about needing a bath mat. Mark mentions how quiet his neighborhood is, and Petey calls it a fortress of solitude. Petey has a flashback to his time in the Lumen basement and his reference to Sunset Park. Back in the present, Petey admits his illness makes him disoriented, but says it's temporary. When Mark asks about Sunset Park, Petey claims he doesn't know. At home, Harmony Coble shows concern for Mark. Meanwhile, Petey explains to Mark that having two lives merged together has made his past and present blurry. He talks about people who believe Severance is harmful and are planning to stop it. Petey hints that Mark might be involved in something sinister at Lumen and mentions a secret department where people don't leave. When Mark insists Severance has helped him cope, Petey disagrees, saying Mark is still carrying his pain without realizing it. Mark leaves without responding to Petey's claims. Coble spies on Mark from her home, while Mark watches a debate on Severance and falls asleep. The next morning, Mark tells Petey he won't reintegrate, explaining that Severance helps him cope with his wife's death. Petey says Mark's pain is still with him at work. Mark leaves for Lumon. At work, Helly reveals she deleted the scary numbers the previous day and submitted a resignation request, which gets denied. Confused, Helly insists her Audi wouldn't do that. At Mark's home, his sister Devin and her husband leave a book on Mark's porch. Coble later takes the book and enters Mark's house to inspect the basement, unaware that Petey is hiding. Helly attempts to escape but is stopped by Mark, who warns her about the consequences. She spits out a hidden note, and Mark takes her to the Perpetuity Wing, where they learn more about Lumen's history. Petey, meanwhile, is lost in his memories, wandering the streets with his floor plan sketch. Coble discusses Petey's reintegration with the Lumen board, while Helly tries to rebel again but gets sent to the break room. There, Milchick forces her to repeatedly recite an apology statement as punishment. Back at work, Mark finds Petey's map hidden in old photos. Meanwhile, Petey has a breakdown at a gas station and collapses. Mark follows the ambulance but drives away after seeing Petey being taken by EMTs. At home, Mark clears the basement of Petey's presence, but finds Petey's phone ringing. Helly is in the break room, rereading her compunction statement under Milchick's watchful eye. After numerous repetitions, Milchick remains unsatisfied and dismisses her until the next day. When Helly steps into the elevator, time has passed without her realizing it, and she looks shaken as she re-enters the break room, continuing to repeat the statement. Frustrated and on the verge of tears, Helly begins to question the voice she hears, but Milchick sternly demands she stay on script. Meanwhile, Mark, at home, notices missed calls on Petey's phone. At work, Irving informs Mark that Helly has been in the break room for a long time. Bert from O&D visits their office, and though Dylan is defensive, Bert invites them to tour his department. Irving, intrigued by the idea of different departments working together, follows Bert. Helly returns to MDR after her ordeal, visibly dazed. She tells Mark she had to repeat the statement 1,072 times. As they talk about strange voices in the break room, Mark tries to comfort her, saying she apologized correctly. Despite their light banter, Helly remains deeply shaken. Irving and Bert share a conversation about art and their connection to Lumen's founder, Keir. Back in MDR, Helly finds Petey's map and confronts Mark, accusing him of being more loyal to Lumen than to his friend. In frustration, Mark shreds the map, trying to move on from the situation. Later, they discover Rickon's book, but Helly is preoccupied with her own plan. She retrieves a paper cutter, barges into Coble's office, and threatens to harm herself unless she's allowed to resign. Coble agrees to let her film a resignation video. However, when Helly watches the video with the others, her Audi coldly denies the resignation, reminding Helly she has no control. Mark learns that Petey has died, while Coble retrieves Petey's chip. Helly, emotionally devastated, attempts suicide by hanging herself in the elevator using an extension cord. Helly is hanging by an extension cord around her neck in the elevator. Mark walks down the hall. The elevator door opens, showing Helly still hanging in front of an empty guard's desk. The door closes again. In MDR, Dylan secretly reads Rickon's book. Mark notices Helly is gone and tells Dylan he can leave, but Dylan stays. Mark calls the elevator and Grainer runs toward him. When the elevator opens, Mark sees Helly hanging. He lifts her up and Grainer helps untie her. They lay her on the floor and Grainer tells Mark to go upstairs. As he goes up, Mark's innie self changes to his unaware outie self. When Mark returns to work, he switches back to his innie and finds Koble and Milchick waiting. He asks if Helly is alive. Koble says Helly is in the hospital with bad bruises, but no permanent damage. Mark thinks Helly will be fired, but Koble says Helly's outie doesn't want her to quit, so she'll be back in a few days. Koble subtly blames Mark for the incident. Mark reads Rickon's book during breaks, hearing the author's self-important voice as he gives rebellious self-help advice. Meanwhile, in Koble's office, Grainer reports that Petey's chip shows full synaptic coupling, meaning he was reintegrated. Grainer assumes Koble hasn't told the board yet due to Helly's suicide attempt. Koble stays silent, confirming Grainer's suspicion that she hasn't informed the board about Helly either. She tells Grainer to keep analyzing Petey's chip and find out who reintegrated him, so she can present everything at once. As Mark leaves work, he sees many missed calls from Rickon. One voice message reveals that Devon is going into labor, and they're heading to a birthing retreat. At home, Koble wears Petey's chip as a necklace. Grainer calls to tell her that further analysis of the chip points to Ragabi as the person who reintegrated Petey, saying, "She cracked reintegration, I'll find her." After hanging up, Koble kneels to pray at an altar to Kier. Meanwhile, Mark retrieves Petey's phone in his basement, still seeing the many missed calls. While in his car, he decides to stop, takes the battery out, and throws the phone and battery into the trash. Bert shows Irving a secret, plant-filled room, suggesting it could be their private place. Bert holds Irving's hand, asking if it's okay. They talk about company rules against relationships. Irving says he isn't ready for romance, but Bert asks him to just stay. At a park, Devon meets Gabby, who now has a newborn. Gabby seems confused when Devon reminds her of their earlier meeting. Devon notices Gabby has named her baby differently than she mentioned before. Gabby's husband, Angelo, arrives and seems distant. Devon finds the interaction odd. Back at Lumen, Irving suggests to Mark, Helly, and Dylan that they try uniting the departments, starting with another visit to O&D. While Dylan is unsure, Helly believes O&D holds the next clue to figuring out what Lumen really does. They agree to visit, despite Mark's hesitation. When Milchick arrives, they quickly cover up their conversation. Later, Mark gets into trouble with Koble for sneaking Helly out. She blames him for the team's poor performance and yells at him for not understanding Lumon's mission. She then revokes the department's hallway privileges. At home, Dylan's innie self suddenly awakens, confused, with Milchick nearby. Milchick demands to know where Dylan hid the ideographic card he took from O&D, as seen on video footage. Dylan, shocked to be in his Audie's house, says he hid it at work and didn't know its importance. When Dylan's son enters, his innie self is stunned, unaware of his Audi life. Milchick, speaking into a phone, says, "End it," and Dylan reverts to his Audi state, calm again. In response to Dylan's question, Milchick simply says, "We're good," and leaves. Mark faces a series of revelations and challenges. He meets a mysterious woman who claims to have helped Petey, but the truth behind Petey's death is darker than Mark expected. She tells him that it was Petey's failure to follow medical advice after a reintegration procedure that killed him. She also reveals that she implanted Mark's chip and is the only one who can deactivate it. As they speak, Doug Grainer, the head of Lumen Security, appears. He is soon knocked out and killed by the woman, who forces Mark to help move the body. She informs him that Grainer worked in security on the severed floor. After disposing of the body, she takes Grainer's badge and gives it to Mark, saying it will grant him untraceable access to the Lumen facility. She orders him to go home, dispose of his clothes, and tells him that she'll be in touch to finish what Petey started. At home, Mark's attempt to lie to Alexa about his whereabouts falters, and he admits to leaving because he needed to drive. The next day, he finds Grainer's black badge in his pocket, and although uncertain, he keeps it. At work, Mark discovers his new locked office, which feels more like a prison. Meanwhile, the team is subjected to the music dance experience as part of a reward, though it soon turns disturbing for Dylan. He experiences a flashback of his son and reacts violently toward Milchick, which leads to the cancellation of the experience. Later, the group begins to unravel more about Lumen's hidden operations. They use Grainer's badge to access the security office, where they discover a manual that details the overtime contingency, a protocol to wake workers off-site. The team plans to exploit this system to awaken their innie selves on the outside. Irv later attends a retirement party for Bert, where tensions rise as he confronts Milchick about the differences between severed and non-severed lives. Meanwhile, Mark's emotional struggles continue to unfold, with a poignant revelation that his late wife is actually his innie, Miss Casey. The scene then unfolds in a surreal and tension-filled setting at Lumen Industries, where the main characters, Mark, Helly, Dylan, and Irving, continue to navigate their strange and oppressive environment. In a sequence of events, Mark and Harmony's relationship shifts as work pressures mount. Mark, reflecting on his role, contemplates quitting Lumon. Meanwhile, Helly and the rest of the team face the grueling demands of the department, and Helly's success in refining a file leads to her brief moment of triumph, though her outward reaction remains stoic. The wellness session with Miss Casey reveals the eerie disconnection between the company and its workers, with Mark desperately trying to intervene, only to face the impersonal nature of Lumen's system. Harmony's unexpected firing signals a shift in power dynamics, with the board controlling the fate of employees like her. Irving's frustration with the company's expectations is mirrored in his paintings, while Dylan, seemingly uninterested in the social ritual of the waffle party, instead finds himself tangled in a deeper layer of Lumen's manipulation. A sense of foreboding builds as Harmony faces her downfall, and the tension peaks when Dylan attempts to awaken the other workers in a desperate bid for autonomy. Mark, struggling with his identity in this controlled world, grapples with the prospect of escaping Lumon. In the final moments, a pivotal act of defiance takes place as Dylan activates the overtime function, signaling an attempt to break free from the confines of their severed realities. Dylan activates the switches, putting Mark, Helly, and Irv into overtime contingency mode. In split screen, they snap awake in their outie worlds. At a party, Harmony asks Mark if he's okay, mentioning an important decision. Mark, confused, doesn't recognize his sister and walks through the event, seeing everything for the first time. Irv, at home, stumbles upon old memories, including a military uniform and papers about Lumon. He starts piecing together his past and heads to Bert's house. Helly attends the gala, where her father speaks about her role in Lumon. She watches a video of her outie self, Helena, promoting Severance. Mark learns his outie self, a history professor, opted for Severance to avoid the pain of losing his wife, Gemma. Harmony begins to realize Mark's innie self is awake. Meanwhile, Dylan struggles to keep the security door shut, resisting Lumen's intervention. At the gala, Helly reveals herself as an innie, accusing Lumen of lies and torture. The crowd laughs, but her words become more intense as she declares, "We're prisoners." Mark realizes his wife Gemma, whom he thought until now is dead, is actually Miss Casey. Meanwhile, Irv arrives at Bert's house. Milchick finally breaks into the security office. Dylan releases the switches, and Mark running through the living room screaming that his wife Gemma is alive.